All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking part in willing and understanding. We did have to move this back a week, and I'm glad that Charlotte was able to get luckily get everything back online that she could present tonight. So I'm very thankful for her for doing that. If this is your first time for the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series, I welcome you. At the same time, if you bought a ticket for $10. Which we were very thankful for that, but also think about just becoming a member. You can be a member for $40 and you're going to get lectures. We're already scheduling lectures through January right now. So we're basically have one every single week other than really about Christmas and New Year's and Thanksgiving time. So just to give you a quick update, next Tuesday we have Deep Delta Justice, a Black teen, his lawyer, and their groundbreaking battle for the civil rights in the South with Matthew Van Meter. And then October 5th, we have Alan Hoffman presenting on Lafitte in America in 1824 and 1825. So we've got four lectures in October, 2 more in September, and then we have another 4 in November and 2 in December and 1 in January. So for $40, you really do get a great benefit as a member of the Friends of the Cabildo, as well as supporting the Friends and the Louisiana State Museum. But tonight's speaker received her undergraduate degree at the University of New Orleans in Urban and Regional Planning and Studies and has a master's degree from Tulane University. As a history practitioner, she won the Louisiana Historical Association's 2020 Hugh F. Rankin Graduate Award and has written articles for Preservation in Print, Country Road Magazine, and Antenna Signals. Currently, she serves as the Operations and Programming Manager at the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House, which is our topic tonight. So please welcome Charlotte Jones.
Hey, everyone. Thank you, Jason, so much. I'm happy to be here, all things considered. Actually started pulling together this presentation more than a month ago, so before Hurricane Ida. Now, obviously, not a lot, but quite of the content has also changed to reflect a bit of the last month. And so just kind of a warning to everyone who's tuning in, there will be images of hurricane destruction, if that might be upsetting for you. Most of it's near the end of the evening, but I just wanted to go ahead and let everyone know. All right, so let's go ahead and jump on in. We have a few things we're going to cover tonight about the museum itself, which is known historically as the Woodland Plantation. Since my wonderful colleague John has established a museum inside the old Woodland Plantation main house, we have rebranded it as the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. Now, right away, we began getting questions about why would you change the name? It's been this name for over a century, etc. And one part of it is we have 2 main topics, 2 main exhibits in the museum. First being the 1811 German Coast Uprising, and second about Kid Ory, musician who was born on the Woodland Plantation in 1886. So we will very briefly go over these 2 exhibits and another exhibit that is on the site called Stomping Grounds, which is about mules in Southeast Louisiana, which I curated about a year ago, just over a year ago. And we're also going to look more kind of at a broader history of the plantation, which includes its inhabitants outside of the big house. And while focusing on the big house, we're also going to look at the architectural expansion of the main house. And what I want this project to be for the last 9 months, almost 10 months, John and I have been kind of tracing the broader historical geography of the Woodland Plantation and how that helped spur the development of the community that we now know as Laplace. And of course, as I just mentioned, we're also going to be covering a little bit about the kind of best way to put it, the current cultural resource crisis after Hurricane Ida. All right. And I don't have, well, since I'm screen sharing, if anyone has a question, you're just going to have to wait till the end so I can see it. I think Jason is going to be delegating that, but just to give you a heads up. All
Yeah,
right.
put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end and I'll ask them a Charlotte. But don't, if you think of something now, put it in the chat and we'll answer it later on. Don't, we don't want you to forget it. So,
Yes. And one of the things I like to do as someone who considers themselves a history practitioner, one of the things I want to do with this presentation is kind of present to you tools that you can use along the way. If there's something that you're interested in, you don't know where to start, hopefully some of these resources will help you out in the long run. So, all right. There we go. And just again, a quick overview. My colleague John, who's listening in, he's the managing director of the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. So he owns the museum, the artifacts within it, unless they're on loan. And pretty much this is his brainchild. He is the author of Creole Trombone, Kid Ory, and the Early Years of Jazz. And he's also the co-author of Giacomo, the Native Roots of Mardi Gras Indians. He spent 3 decades as a photojournalist with the Times-Picayune, also known as now the Advocate-Picayune. And he has by and large been an active voice for the protection of New Orleans and Louisiana cultural landmarks. As y'all know, he's been trying to preserve the Buddy Bolden House long before anyone else was. So I'm thrilled that he brought me on board and kind of let me just elbow my way into this project. And just a quick overview about me. Some of y'all know me here through my days as a carriage driver, which once a buggy driver, always a buggy driver. I am currently pursuing my PhD in anthropology. I'm actually here at my office in LSU because the internet has not quite come back yet to Laplace. We just got brand new power poles. So, we're waiting for those cables to come with it. And again, I got involved with the museum whenever I approached John about curating an exhibit on mules, which is kind of where my, if you want to call it specialty, lies. And I can't wait for Jason to get on board with a mule lecture because, it's going to happen. And sure enough, most of y'all know my partner in crime here, pictured here, Chica, and she does make a couple of cameos throughout this presentation. She was basically our summertime intern, and it was quite a joy and an experience having her out at the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. All right. So we're going to start off with a broader history. First, a little bit about the actual location, which we now call Laplace. As many of y'all know, that was originally the site of the German coast, or it is known historically as the German coast. On the other side of the Mississippi River, excuse me, a group of German families who were enticed to come over here through John Law's kind of financial scheme ended up in the area that we now call the German coast. Excuse me. And it was originally known as Karlstein after one of the leaders of these kind of families. And they originally really took to the West Bank around present day Lucy, which I don't even think that's technically an incorporated town anymore. But it's also known as the Bonnie Care Point. And if you look at the map there, just across from the star, I did not know this until recently. The literal translation of Bonnie Care is square hat. So around this time, the left bank remained mostly untouched by colonial presence since the Wakita Native Americans were still there. It was not until they began pushing them out that we start to see more of these German settlers go to what we call the East Bank. And first begin around St. Charles Parish and eventually began to move up to what is now St. John the Baptist Parish, where Laplace is located. And that area, that kind of stretch from Laplace to Mons, Louisiana, was known historically as the Bonnie Care Bend. So that can get a little confusing when we're looking at old newspapers. If it's Bonnie Care Point, Bonnie Care Bend, if it's actually the stretch of towns, or if it's specifically what is now known as Laplace. So it's during the German coast era and these families coming in. Many historians have thanked them for their presence because they basically kept the colonizers in New Orleans alive with produce, farm goods. They basically fed the city. And that's also where we begin to see a lot of names that are still common throughout the German coast, such as Adel, Huber, Weber, and Schoff, Vicknair, the list goes on and on. But many of these Germans quickly assimilated with the colonial French, and perhaps one of the most retold kind of name changes that occurred throughout this area is the German name of Zweig became known as La Branche, since it is essentially a stick. All right, now, oh wait, wrong keyboard. Sorry, I'm working on 2 computers here so I can look at my notes. Now, by 1793, Manuel Andri gets a vast land concession that is now, or becomes the Woodland Plantation, now the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. And at one point, he briefly sold it to his best way to put it, to Francois Badusky. Their children were married into each other, so it was, you know, the other in-law, good way to put it. And he gets the land back in 1808 until 1811. He was granted 40 arpents on the Bonnicaire Bend, and the way that it fans out with the arpent system, he accumulated about 2,000 acres of land. So he was by and large the largest landowner in the area. As you can see by this map, this was surveyed by Glenn Conrad and Gertrude Taylor, showing the kind of ownership around 1804 to 1812. And I also highlighted the widow Jacques Delon and widow George Delon plantations because Manuel Andri's children married into this plantation, to the Deslon family, creating one kind of even larger land holding than before. And as we know, when we'll briefly go over the 1811 German Coast Uprising, the enslaved would have worked essentially all 3 plantations, would have been passed back and forth or traversed back and forth. But Manuel Andri himself enslaved 85 humans. And John has been looking into the background of many of these enslaved, as many as we can find. And sure enough, like many of the enslaved at the time in Louisiana, they originated from the Bight of Benin, the Congo, and the Gold Coast. We believe that the original structure of the plantation would have been as a French layout. This is defined by John Rader, who wrote Delta Sugar. The book is kind of hard to find nowadays, but if you can get your hands on it, I highly recommend it. And the way he lays out, or the way he describes a French plantation versus an American plantation, is that the dwellings for the enslaved were pretty much aligned into a linear fashion on a French plantation. Whereas American plantations, these enslaved quarters were often laid out into more of a grid or into a block system. There we go. And let's see, next one. Now, this is a modern blueprint, obviously, of the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. The green box highlights the oldest section of the house, which we do believe was built around 1793. We have a lot of architectural evidence to support this, including the foundation. It just fits in well at the time. It consists of 4 L-shaped brick corner piers that line up the corners of these 2 core rooms. This is pretty much in the classic chamber and salon plan. The yellow square on the left would have been your chamber. I'm sorry, it would have been your salon. It would have been your more public area, your more co-living area, whereas the chamber would have been more the private space. Let's see. And so between the architectural evidence and the textual evidence we have, we are more than certain that the room where our 1811 exhibit is housed is the room where the rebellion occurred on the night of January 8th, 1811. Whenever the house was renovated in 2017, it was a multi-year renovation. The owner of the house and his kind of local group of artists and friends and architects were able to retrieve a lot of the bousselage, or found the bousselage underneath the old beadboard walls. So that follows the traditional French colombage, I can't say that word, method of infilled framings with this kind of mud, Spanish moss, clay deposits. Good way to put it. So on that night, Charles Deslandes, who was a biracial overseer enslaved on the Jacques Deslandes plantation, and kind of I don't want to say gang, a group of rebels attack Manuel Andre while he's sleeping. He was struck with an axe, and this officially starts off the 1811 rebellion. Manuel Andre was killed. His son Gilbert, Manuel Andre was injured. His son Gilbert was killed. He was actually struck a deadly blow by the axe. Obviously, I'm not going to get into too many details of the 1811 rebellion, just because the information is not only out there, but we want you to come learn about the days of the event at our museum whenever we reopen. Not to shamelessly market, but there's a reason why we have this museum in place. Now, if you actually look above the mantle, you can see a reproduction portrait of Gilbert. This is based off of another portrait that we believe is based off of a miniature. And one of the kind of Facebook groups out there debated the origins of this portrait, whether or not it was Gilbert. And that is not my specialty. I'm not here to say they are right or wrong. But I want to point out to you guys one of these stories that we don't really get to tell on tour, and it's a very interesting one. And a couple months ago now, we actually had a family visit. Originally lived in New Orleans, since moved off, and they came back with 3 or 4 children, and they had actually traced their ancestry back to Gilbert Andre, who, even though he was killed, whenever he was killed, his wife was about 3 months pregnant. And about 7 generations later, I think y'all can see the resemblance. And unfortunately, I forget this kid's name, but he was kind of standing astute to try to look like Gilbert. And, he's kind of goofing off, but his mother was pretty astounded of the similarities. And so shortly after the 1811 rebellion, within months, Manuel Andre sells the plantation back to Francois Badusky. There we go. And underneath the information here, we actually have a little bit of that colombage for you, the bousselage, just a nice little picture real quick. Now, by 1820, Badusky enslaved 60 people on the site, and that number grew exponentially within 10 years to another 101 enslaved. And we know that 2 free people of color were also listed under the census record as being part of the plantation. It's during this time is kind of at least a growth that we have historical evidence of woodland. We see an animal powered mill coming in. Oh, that's supposed to say corn. I'm sorry. Corn mill, drainage house, kitchen, hospital. Go. And Francois Badusky dies in 1831. It's actually his succession records that we're able to see the kinds of ins and outs of the plantation. But he also expanded the house during this time. And the picture on the right is a picture from pre-renovation, so around 2017. And this is one of the rooms that he built. And kind of going back, there we go. Kind of going back to the far side of the house, they actually built a gallery. And so your 2 darker kind of gray squares are the new rooms that were added. and then the gallery, which was enclosed in the 1840s under the new ownership of the Hollingsworth family, which we'll get into in a little bit. And so one of the Badusky kids moved upriver. I shouldn't say kids, but one of the Badusky heirs moves upriver, buys a plantation, and there is a kind of silly folklore that a peddler comes by wanting to sell some goods, or at least wanting to actually stay the night since he was in the middle of nowhere, which was kind of the custom for the men of the house to let these travelers stay around this time. And apparently the younger Bandusky said, nah, get out of here. And supposedly, again, this is kind of a fun little legend or folklore. The young man was named Leon Godcho, and he said, well, just remember, I reserved this space for me later. And that site is now the site of the Godcho house in Reserve. See all the connections there. And this is actually a picture of the Godcho house as of last week. Many of y'all probably know this already if you've been keeping up with the river parishes. The Godcho house had been under extensive renovations for quite some time. So the damage that it incurred was quite significant with its new roof. And we have a dormer window lying in the front yard. So hopefully they'll be able to get back on track. We'll see what happens. Now, over the last couple of months, the University of New Orleans and the Milo Center has been conducting shovel tests and doing some kind of preliminary archaeological work on the site of the woodland plantation. And we call this phase 1. It's part of a service learning class. It's been a blast having the students out there during the spring semester. And we do look forward to hopefully having them back out soon. And over the spring, these shovel tests were conducted. And as Dr. Ryan Gray very kindly wrote up for me, so I could break it down to you without getting everything wrong, this kind of investigation, this initial investigation, is for identifying areas for future investigation. And one of the things that we were able to trace looking for this kind of historical archaeology, things like ceramics, nails, building materials, is that not a lot of action happened in the front of the house. The side on the left is the side facing River Road. And this is a lovely heat map that was pulled together where you can really see the concentration of ceramics that were excavated during a shovel test. And it's unsurprising that kind of where it's the warmest is where traditionally during the antebellum period, we would have seen outbuildings, these earlier antebellum buildings, where we would have seen outbuildings such as a separated kitchen, enslaved dwellings for kind of your domestic enslaved, things like that. And now that we have access to the back acreage, we're going to try to hopefully get back out there and do some more shovel tests. That would grant us about another 2 to 3 acres. And there's actually an old oak alley back there as well that we look forward to exploring. I think that Dr. Gray and I and John agree that this is probably where hopefully where kind of that first concentration of enslaved dwellings were, which were likely reorganized or removed after the 1811 rebellion. And as we'll get into in a bit, there was also a series of crevasses around Bonnicaire, around the German coast, I think may have actually also pushed out some of those dwellings or would have convinced plantation owners to put these dwellings somewhere else. All right. And speaking of Chica, we actually found quite a bit of ceramics near her little pen in the back of the property. And it wasn't too long after, I'll get into that in a minute. But here's an example of some of the ceramics the students have excavated, including a bone and a button. I think that's also a pipe up at the top. And these students, they tell me all the time what type of ceramic this is, if it's pearlware, And of course, I instantly blank on the name. So if I don't write it down, I don't remember. But luckily, we'll have once the report's up, we'll be able to refer to it fairly easily. But yeah, I was saying about Chica. Chica really kind of took to the UNO students while they were out there, and she would watch, as a mule does, to see what they were up to, see if they were in trouble. And in one particular corner of her pen, she kept digging up artifacts. And so, in the Stomping Grounds exhibit, which again about mules, we actually put together kind of a little collection, and we call it Bad Mule Archaeology, quite jokingly, because she did everything an archaeologist is not supposed to do. I mean, the holes were a mess. She wasn't keeping records. She did no kind of archival research beforehand. And we joke that she was trying to, ponder these off so she could get oats, which, is kind of illegal to trade artifacts in Louisiana. So, but if y'all do come out to the museum, be sure to check it out. She really pulled together quite a collection. And it was just from scraping at the ground or pulling up grass, the kind of ruminating things that mules do. All right, so after the Badewskis, the Hollingsworth family moves in. Now, this was kind of purchased as a co-venture by Jacob Hollingsworth and Jesse Smith. Jacob Hollingsworth was an entrepreneur from Maryland, and as far as we can tell, he never actually stepped foot on the grounds. However, after a few years of ownership, he begins to, his son, Samuel, really begins to take an interest in the property, and he begins buying interest in the company. And so he moves his growing family in, and this is also when we see one of these big periods of expansion on the actual woodland plantation, on the actual house as well. And it's also during this time we found the first iteration of it being called the Woodland Plantation rather than the Andre Plantation, which was kind of the long-standing name. During this time, they added Garçonniere, which you can see on the right of this photo, and a side gable, presumably to act as a kitchen that was separate from the house for a long time. They also enclosed that original 1810s loggia and added a full-length rear gallery. Now, when the house was purchased in 2017, the gallery was actually enclosed, and they were turned into tenants' bathrooms. So there are actually a couple of holes in the porch floor from when there used to be plumbing and pipe fixtures there. Now, hold on, let me check real quick. He also added a couple of other rooms, and one of the rooms on one of the French doors that dates back to the 1810s, there's an inscription that says Nina Hollingsworth, and it's signed in 1862. So the legend that is retained within these walls is that either a suitor or Nina herself were trying to test the integrity of a diamond ring to see if it was real, and etched her name into the glass, and that is on display. Someone also etched their name in the glass in 1962, and so depending on how you feel about that, keep an eye out on the French door come 2062, even though I will be long gone. And here is kind of a visual of that expansion that we see during this time. Excuse me. Now, there we go. As Samuel begins buying these shares in these properties, he begins to venture into other prospects. There we go. Sorry, I lost track of something. Including wanting to connect the back of the woodland plantation to the Fernier village on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain. Now, the state engineer actually in 1858 recommends that instead of trying to build a road as Hollingsworth originally proposed, he suggests building a canal. Now, we can actually see evidence of this canal still. Unfortunately, you can't access it because it is owned by one of the swamp tour companies. And even though I, may occasionally partake in trespassing, I'm not going to where a bunch of alligators think I'm feeding them marshmallows. So hopefully we can get back there one day, just to get a feel for that change in that landscape. By 1860, there are 66 enslaved on the Woodland Plantation. And I came across Samuel Hollingsworth obituary one time, and it seems that he was actually a Republican who eventually decides to become a secessionist. And he is one of the delegates who votes for secession in 1861. So these are kind of the snippets that are here on the screen. And 1867, the New Orleans Republican kind of calls out these men who, as we know, many of them tried to reclaim their property after the Civil War. And like many plantation owners at this time, Samuel Hollingsworth not only dealt with significant losses due to the Civil War, he was also the crop was lost a few times due to different crevasses before the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, real quick, this pink line, this is a modern map of Laplace. You can really get a feel for how these arpent lines are still in place, like so many communities along the Mississippi River. But this pink line is Cardinal Street. And if you keep following this imaginary pink line back, that actually turns to the remnants of the canal. And if you keep following that line after the pink line ends, you can see how it kind of juts over just before the I-10 and US 51 exchange. And then that goes back to Fernier Village, or La Fernier. All right. So considering the law, this is one of these hurricane photos, kind of reiterating the, first, the changes in elevation near this section, near the I-10 US 51 interchange, and kind of heeding the wisdom of that state engineer, Mr. Hebert, back in 1858. This is Old 51, just looking off of the interstate. John and I stayed at the site during Hurricane Ida, and we weren't able to get to any of these kind of locations and see this. So this imagery is actually new for me, even though I was about 4 miles away. So it really stresses the severity of Hurricane Ida recently. Now, as I kind of mentioned with Hollingsworth, we see a lot of physical changes happening around the Woodland Plantation. Pretty much right around the same time, Hollingsworth actually loses the plantation, which I'll get into in just a second. And the kind of next owner, William Choff, and his brother, John Choff, come into. We have a batcher that begins forming in the mid 1800s as silt is basically getting deposited into the bank across from the Bonnicare Point. And you can actually see that to the left of the circle actually highlights the site of the Woodland Plantation. And this newspaper illustration, the break at St. Peter, that's actually from pretty much present day Reserve, but at least gives you an idea of the locality of these crevasses and just how frequent they were and how destructive that they were. And so during this time, as the batcher begins to form, this would eventually become the locale for what are now the oldest structures left in Laplace. If you kind of follow that road leaving from the Woodland Plantation going upriver to the left as we're looking at it, that is the original river road. So when Manuel Andre had the plantation, their kind of man-made levees and the river itself was much closer to the house than it is today. Now again, a series of crevasses begin to kind of slam the Bonnicar Bend, a little more downriver, that kind of divot that you see to the right of the Woodland Plantation. Um, that is one of the more famous ones. And as you're driving along River Road today, you actually the road curves very sharply right there, and it's going with that kind of formation of that old crevasse. So in the 1870s, I believe it's the 1874 crevasse. They get a little confusing because there's so many of them. This was the one that was open for nearly a decade. At the same time, the Yazoo and Mississippi Railroad is actually looking to acquire property and to establish a railroad through these plantations. So they actually sent laborers, predominantly African-American laborers, along with teams of mules and scrapers to close the crevasse. And then this kind of doesn't fit into this narrative, but kind of the broader narrative history of the Mississippi River. There is at least one documented attempted detonation of this levee in 1897. And if you're ever looking for kind of these old maps of the Mississippi River, I put the web address, historical charts through NOAA down there, just so y'all can quickly jot that down. I don't know if anyone saw the piece by the New York Times that was put out a few months ago about trying to track down cemeteries of the enslaved throughout Cancer Alley, because that's where we are, but throughout the river parishes. And this is actually, these maps are kind of one of the essential tools that they use to look for these sites. And that's where we start to see a little bit more of Laplace forming as a community. All right. There we go. And sure enough, the day after Ida, water kind of, we don't get, luckily, knock on wood, we don't see significant flooding. And I think part of it is the old Yazoo and Mississippi Valley Railroad in the back pretty much acts as a dam in a lot of ways. But since, again, this is kind of the oldest portion and we're historically right on the river, this is also the highest ground. However, you begin to see after a really high rain or really long rain, or after a hurricane, you can see in the back of the property where this elevation dips. And and I bet if I had a drone that day and if I was more of a geographer, I have a feeling that this would fit in pretty well with some of the hydrology maps at the time from the Bonnicar crevasse. Let's see. Now, 1872 is kind of another back and forth thing. The Choff and Company officially acquires the Woodland Plantation at a sheriff's auction. Again, this is one of those things where we start to see more significant changes to the site. And this is also where we begin to see, we get more historical resources, right? At least from archives that we can jump into. And this is another reason why we changed the name from Woodland Plantation to the 1811 Kid Ory Historic House. I was digging through Tulane's archives and I knew that they had Woodland Plantation ledgers there, but the website said that they were actually for the Woodland Plantation down in Plaquemines Parish. And I said, we were going to look at those anyways. And sure enough, those are the records and ledgers from from Laplace, from the Woodland Plantation there. And Dr. Adderley, I know you're listening in, so if you get a chance, this might be a good opportunity for some of your students, because I do not have the time to sit there and translate ledgers, but I would be thrilled if someone else did. And here you can just kind of get a feel for what the day-to-day life was like during this time. So we're past the Civil War, we're past emancipation. There's a lot of Reconstruction history happening at this time, which is another thing that John and I are looking into. That will probably be kind of one of our next rotating exhibits. And we know that Woodland, or during the Choff era, hired a lot of day laborers as needed during the busy season. And like many of the plantations around, they particularly employed either African American laborers or Italian laborers, who many of these Italian laborers eventually begin to acquire land and to take up truck farming in the area. And down on the right, this is a very kind of quickly drawn map I found in one of the ledgers drawn upside down. And this is one of those things, it's just kind of one of those historical goodies you want to know more about. And real quick for everyone, the ledger from the field report from 1895 also features a water boy. It's about the 5th line down, who was paid 40 cents a day. And you can kind of see what other men were employed with for the day-to-day labor. Now, this water boy is probably very well Kid Ory, who I'll jump back. We'll get to him in a second. Who was born at the Woodland Plantation in the quarters in 1886. And where he was born is probably right about where Airline Highway and Old 51, Cardinal Street, which at the time was essentially the main street, cross. And we'll circle back to that in just a minute. Now, during the Choff era, we begin to see, again, these physical changes that are still around today. This is a picture of the mule barn that was constructed, I was told, in mid-1880s. And when Kid Ory worked on the plantation, while he was growing up on the plantation, he would often have to get an old mule from the barn and take breakfast and water out to the laborers in the fields. And he actually has quite a few words about this old mule who just sometimes would not go. Imagine that. And also recalls both him and Bertie St. Martin, who has a wonderful oral history about Woodland Plantation in the early 1900s. They both recalled how the mules and the horses and the other livestock, including cattle, were just granted freedom to graze all day, and they would often just walk out to the levees in the morning, graze along that, and then come back in for dinner time. And this is, of course, whenever they weren't actually employed alongside human laborers in the sugar fields. Now, that Cardinal Street I just mentioned is highlighted right here again with the pink line. The circle is the Woodland Plantation, or is kind of the main house, I should say. At the end of the pink line, we actually see kind of the first illustrated position of a sugar house. I'm fairly certain that this is the sugar house because we know that another sugar house was there by the early 1900s. And again, this is actually right about where Airline Highway is today. And we're going to look at a more present map in a bit, so you'll be better able to visualize that. The building on the left is we're not sure if this actually dates back to the 1870s. It's probably younger than that, or if it was actually an original building on Cardinal Street, an original quarter building. However, this kind of gives you a feel for what some of the modern buildings in the wood on Cardinal Street look like, or used to look like, particularly around the turn of the century. Let me check on something real quick. Again, wrong computer. Now, as we've been trying to track down these buildings for the last 9 months, we're trying to figure out this kind of broader history, historical geography, if you want to call it that, of the Woodland Plantation. One thing kind of clued me, kind of presented itself as a clue to me right off the bat, and that was old green, presumably lead-based paint. Now, as a preservationist, or at least whenever I was taking these courses a decade ago, we were kind of taught, at least while documenting historic properties, like don't worry about the paint color, because as we know, you can just slap on a new coat of paint, and call it a day. However, as we're trying to figure out which outbuildings may have originated to the woodland plantation, green became a common factor. And it's actually very hard to see back on the picture of the mule barn, but underneath the awnings there, and you can't see it in this photo, but in person you could see that there were still hints of kind of green blue tint up there, which was also very telling. And so green paint kind of helped me along as this kind of historical detective doing this work on the side. And you'll see a little bit of that on the next slide. Sorry, let me just make sure I'm in the right spot. Oh, I see we're quickly running out of time, so I'll try to hurry this up. So not this slide, but this gives you at least a good feel for kind of the image of the plantation of woodland around the turn of the century, around the 1880s, 1890s. This is actually a picture from, I believe, New Iberia or Iberville Parish, one of the two. I is the key word there, or key letter. We also been told through oral histories, discussions with neighbors, that, and we know from other historical geographies, that the overseer's house is traditionally near the quarters, but not right on top of it. And sure enough, just a few, about half a block down from the 1811 Kid Ory historic house, we have an overseer's house that is still standing. And unlike some of the quarters that we'll see, it's not painted green. It's a nice shade of white. These black and white photos that I've pulled together are also from the Historic Standing Structure Survey. This is one of those treasures that unless you're in the field, you don't really know about it. And I want to tell everyone about it. And I actually first came onto these, not online, even though many of these surveys are available online, but at your local library. And again, just want to reiterate, that is also a wealth of treasure there, libraries. And where would we be without them? But here's an example of a tenant's quarter from that survey on Cardinal Street. And this kind of helped confirm, this picture kind of helped confirm this little breadcrumb trail about green paint. As you can see here, we had passed by this house half a dozen times and thought, well, it could potentially be an old quarter building. But we're just not sure with its, current renovations going on. And sure enough, poking underneath that paper, some old green paint. And the picture on the bottom right is post Ida. The house is usually in much nicer condition. We also have the Bourgeois house, which is located in the Batcher. Eric Bourgeois, who told us about the house, claims that 13 families have come out of there, born and raised there, and I believe it. I unfortunately have not had the stamina to go by and see if it's still standing after Ida, and I hope it is, but I have the feeling it's not. Circling back to Kid Ory, again, he was born in 1886. This picture is with his band on the woodland plantation. And like I said earlier, he worked there as a child. He began showing an interest in music on the plantation, and he basically began building guitars out of cigar boxes, whatever he could get his hands on. And again, I don't want to give too much away. You got to come see it in person, particularly his trombone that's on display. That was his while he lived and played in New Orleans. Now, I'm going to kind of quickly go through this just because we are running out of time. At the same time, we have the Choff company doing its thing. The Laplace family, just upriver, is kind of completing the other half of the current footprint of the town of Laplace. If any of my historian friends want to do a full-fledged biography on this family, I highly recommend it. And if I have any friends in Hollywood who want to help me write a screenplay about this, it's kind of like the Wild West of the river parishes. I don't want to get too much into it for the sake of time, and we have more to cover, but Basile Laplace Jr., who was a state senator, was quite an interesting character, and I don't mean that in the best of ways. But more importantly, we see on that plantation further back another sugar mill. I also know that there was like a lumber mill on site, so it could be that, but it's in that kind of traditional sugar plantation layout, which a good chunk of that is actually now a golf course. So that bears more study down the road. In 1898, the Orys and Lasanes, and also Leon Keller, purchased the woodland plantation as a co-investment, which again, quite common on this site. And they expand the house to its current footprint. John L. Ory managed the plantation and lived in the house. He also had a big family, much like the Hollingsworth. And this is when we start to see kind of your Greek revival elements coming in, decorative brackets, tongue and groove wood ceiling, front railings of sawn balusters. We see a couple extra rooms added or brought all together, which that's essentially the floor plan that we have now. The green and the purple is the Ory era. And it's also during this time we see a few more changes happening to woodland. John L. Ory begins to really use the bachelor to his advantage, or tries to. He tries to grow alfalfa and oats, even though that's not very conducive with the humidity here. And around 1900, they build a carriage house, and later on they add a garage to the left side of that, and other workspaces as well. Now, this sign is luckily still preserved quite well inside the carriage house. Notice no loafers allowed in here. And that very well could have been directed at his distant cousin, Kid Ory. We also see, we know around this time, there were additional cisterns built. There was a blacksmith shop. Friends who follow me on Twitter heard me go into a rave about a blacksmith shop recently. I was referring originally to this building on the left. Now I'm beginning to think this may have been kind of like the carriage warehouse for sugar wagons. I'm not exactly sure what that was for, but I don't think it was a blacksmith shop anymore. We also begin to see, and again, common theme here, green paint, tankers coming in, holding water, molasses, gas, whatever was needed to continue plantation operations. There we go. Now, part of the reason why I backtracked on the blacksmith shop is in Bertie St. Martin's oral history about woodland plantation after 1900, she mentions that the blacksmith lived on site, built his own house, and eventually kind of became the last acting overseer of the company relations around 1920. And sure enough, in the back is a red structure that was probably his blacksmith shop. This is another hurricane damage photo. I couldn't get a picture to the front because, trespassing, but hopefully I'll get over there eventually. And then it's also during this time under the Orys, around the 1910s and so on, that we really begin to see Laplace, or what we call Laplace today, develop as a community. We have the Woodland Store, which the white overseer's house next to that ticket was actually occupied by one of the proprietors of a kind of variation of the Woodland Store that was built later, known as the Brady and Granier Company. They built the Orys and the Lasanes built a church, the St. Joan of Arc Church. They commissioned kind of the local master carpenter, John Pastoreau, and then his son also becomes a carpenter. I assume it's his son, Jules Pastoreau. And they built many of the structures that you still can see today. Unfortunately, this one in the bottom middle is no longer around. But obviously we're jumping into Queen Anne style here. And this is a guy who's hard to find. So if anyone wants to start looking, please let me know. We also have a Woodman of the World Hall built around this time. they begin to help spur the growth of River Road, which was still then known as Jefferson Highway, just to show you just how far that extended. And we also see the Montz family coming in, who at first leased land from the Orys and the Lasanes, and eventually began to buy their own land. They built an ice factory there. There we go. And I know the picture on the left is it's from the late 80s. It's a Times-Picayune photo. And the Montz here is actually hoping to turn this space into a museum. And right down the road, this is likely, this is right from the ice factory, and is probably related to that, but it could also be from the woodland, more from the woodland plantation side of things. All right, and then this is a Mounier photo, George Mounier. This kind of gives you a good idea of what the sawmill may have looked like. We don't know what plantation, what area this is from, but since, you know, definitely co-hosting this with Friends of Cabildo, there is a excellent Mounier exhibit on display now at the Cabildo, and definitely go check it out before it disappears. And we know that the sugar house, again, this is the only picture of the sugar house we've been able to find. And again, it stood at Old 51, near Cardinal Street, and Airline Highway / US 61. And it burnt down at least once. I'm pretty sure it burnt down twice. A lot of fires that happen around Laplace. I'm not suggesting anything, but there's a lot. And again, just to kind of reiterate what the footprint of the woodland plantation and how that spurred the development of Laplace. So this is a 1912 map of what was left of the plantation. And just past that line, more or less, is the old Laplace plantation, plus or minus a few more narrow strips of land. And here's the hurricane. This is where that cultural resource crisis comes in. August 29th, 2021. Ida struck, as I told y'all earlier. I don't want to get into many details about it, but John and I wrote out the hurricane. I don't have the stamina to retell that story, but the pictures speak for itself. On the aerial photo in the bottom there, that's actually the old mule barn that we lost circa mid-1880s. And then in the front, we actually also lost the 100-year-old magnolia trees that John L. Ory and his family planted. So same thing with the carriage house. The barge board A-frame blew out, but we're actually think we'll be able to rebuild this. And the long-term plan was to turn this into some kind of interpretive center. I'm voting mules, but you know me. So hopefully there's some silver lining that comes out of this particular loss. Here's another picture of the mule barn and what may have been that kind of carriage warehouse, that sugar wagon warehouse, general outbuilding. We do not own the mule barn, so we have no say in its future, and it looks pretty grim. This is a picture from the woodland quarters. I should have thrown in more modern photos of the woodland quarters, but lack of time and everything else, I couldn't get it together. But the quarters did flood, and we are trying to connect with the Rising Star Baptist Church to see how our community partners, including Tulane and UNO, can help. The overseer's house, that was part of the old store. The roof is gone. The picture at the bottom, this is kind of the old commissary warehouse, kind of your loading building. And overall, it did okay, but this building has also been sitting in neglect for decades. So, and again, these are properties we don't own. These are properties we don't get to show you when you come to visit the museum. This is a big part of the reason why I wanted to pull this lecture together, to show that the remains are out there outside of just the four walls of the museum. St. Joan of Arc Church, the wings were expanded. The building was expanded at one point. I'm not sure when. Took a little bit of damage up there at the top, but overall it should be okay. And this is the old Mont's Ice Factory. What was left of it, a big portion of it had already burned down by the 80s. And I believe that one of the Mont's descendants wanted to turn what was remaining into some kind of museum. But this was back in the early 90s, and obviously that never came to. So luckily and hopefully, with our community partners and with the work that we've been doing, we can at least try to survey what's left, since preservation is mostly out of the option. And of course, right after Hurricane Ida, this is the next day, the next afternoon, decided to not tamper, what's the word? But it decided to tease us a little bit with some beautiful skies. And that's really all I got. I know that I went to the hour rather than leaving time for questions, but I'm here. If anyone has questions, please let me know.
Oh no, that's fine. We've got that's the good thing about recording it and sending it off. Somebody gets off, can't finish it. We've got the ability to resend it to them. So thank you so much for the lecture. I do have some questions, so we'll get started with that. And if you have any other questions, please use the chat function. Just put them in there, and I will be asking them as we go along. So the first question, let's see. Was from Laura Adderley. Was this business of significant architectural changes and radical changes in footprint the more common experience for these large 1800s wealthy people's homes? The site is on a 200+ years of non-indigenous habitation. How many major changes in its footprint, size, architecture over that time?
Oh, I'm rereading it. I mean, I believe so. It varied by plantation and plantation, these kind of enlargements. Obviously this plantation is very different from other ones, like the San Francisco plantation, even though they had common owners. It was and has always been a kind of working space, even for the actual owners of the ones who lived in the big house, whether they were owners or the kind of managers. And so I assume it was more common for wealthy owners, particularly just going for more size. That's something I have to look back and get to you on.
Okay.
Got it busy.
Could you tell the name of the author of the Delta Sugar again?
Yeah, and I only briefly mentioned it back at the beginning. So that is John Rader, Rehder. And you can find his dissertation printed out. It's kind of the same structure. The book Delta Sugar also re-examines the more modern plantation complexes. And Dr. Adderley, I don't know the question about the hospitals. I'm assuming it's for the enslaved, since again, that was kind of the common pattern at the time. This is the information that we have at this point. Now, as we can get along, or as we can move along and do more in-depth historical research, I hope to find out more about this. This is what we were able to pull from succession records that were featured in the National Register nomination, which is where we get a lot of this kind of baseline information that we hope we can expand upon from there. Same thing with the enslaved people about cemeteries. We just don't know where on the site, and we're hoping that archaeological work will help us figure out that key missing information.
Let's see. She asked about drone use. Has that been used by a lot of people in the river parishes? When you mentioned you'd love to have had a drone to fly up there.
Well, the owner, John has a drone that's not working, and the actual house owner, Tim, he brought a drone out that day. That's how we got that photo of the hurricane damage. I mean, I think it's becoming more common for insurance adjusters and just researchers in general, and even photographers, to get into drones. I have no clue. I've never flown one. Also, some of the people here know my Twitter handle. it doesn't sound the most professional at first, so I'm apologize right away, but it's actually based off of my mule. So it is swamp_cheeks, because that's one of Chica's many nicknames is Cheeks. Thank you, Chris. It is funny, right? All right, so
we have a lecture on mule history. I think that would be fascinating, and so we'll talk about that later on, about maybe doing something later on. I think it would be a great talk.
It's a fun one now, especially with all the garbage problems going on in all of Southeast Louisiana. So since they were the original garbage haulers.
Jane says, my grandparents own Hike Store in Reserve. Where's the best resource for me to research that area?
That name sounds briefly familiar. Hike Store outside Reserve. One of the first places I would recommend looking is, as soon as it hopefully reopens, is the St. John the Baptist Parish Library. Their Louisiana Reading Room is an excellent resource. Unfortunately, I just don't know the state of it right now, because if it was open, I would have been there all this week. But I know it's not open. I just don't know what kind of damage it sustained. If that store was around in the 80s, or at least the physical structure of it was, you should be able to find it through that historical structure survey, hopefully. I can't say for sure. And then if you're looking, unfortunately, being out in the river parishes, we don't have the luxury of the Sanborn fire insurance maps like New Orleans does. But there may be one for Reserve. I doubt it, but it's always possible.
All right, we have one. Let me see if I can. Gloria McConnell says a mule lecture would be a fantastic idea. I agree with her. The last one comes from Dr. Adderley. One more, and she says, separate from your interest in mules, what was animal life out there on the plantation? As a historian of Black enslavement, and there's always murmuring that we don't pay enough attention to animal husbandry. Yes, most captive labor was in sugar, but what was the animal agricultural pattern at this site?
That would have varied from place to place. This is actually a big part of what my master thesis was on. It was more about that relationship with animals after the Civil War, but it has roots during enslavement. Generally, I'm going to briefly talk about this, because I can go on and I don't want to. I've been in this room for like 12 hours. But usually animals during enslavement were unnoticed to the enslavers. I mean, they were commodity items, they were economic, they were used to push and pull and plow. And what happens is, most of the time, their care was more well thought of. They were better taken care of than the enslaved. Now, after the Civil War, as a kind of lost cause trope, we began to see a purposeful anthropomorphization of giving animals human-like characteristics, to negate reconstruction, to make it less important, to make emancipation less important. They try to level particularly mules and African Americans as equals, which obviously is so far from the truth. So that's just kind of your baseline relationship there. As for the day-to-day animal husbandry practices, it really just depends on the space and the site and who is managing them.
Let me see if we don't think we have anybody else. So I want to thank you, Charlotte, so much for the great talk tonight. Yeah. And for your recovery efforts, and hope everything goes smoothly. And if you'd like to make a donation to the museum, you can go straight directly to their website, and then or you can go visit the museum when they're up and running. That's always the best way to see museums. So tomorrow you'll be getting a link to the recording from tonight. So and I hope to see y'all next week for our lecture series. And thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. And we will see you next time. And thank you so much, Charlotte. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'll see y'all soon.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. Thank you.